The public shaming was designed to crush her soul. Standing in the center of the iron-bound hall of the Thornhaven pack, Nyx watched as Jaxon, the man who had held her future in his hands since they were pups, looked down at her with a sneer of pure loathing. He expected a spectacle. He expected the half-blood girl with the tainted Blackwood name to crumble into a sobbing heap, proving her unworthiness to everyone watching. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She didn't scream. She didn't let a single tear mar her stone-cold expression. She didn't crawl through the dirt to beg for a scrap of his affection. She simply straightened her spine, met his eyes with a terrifying calm, and spoke 4 words that chilled the room. "I accept your rejection." The ensuing quiet was more violent than any roar. In the world of the pack, a rejected mate was a broken thing, destined to claw at their own skin as the mate bond ripped away in a jagged, agonizing tear. And they were supposed to lose their minds, wailing for a mercy that would never come. But Nyx remained a statue of defiance, her face an unreadable mask of ice that struck a deeper fear into the wolves than any outburst could have. By the law of the pack, this was her death sentence. She should have been marked as an outcast and hunted like prey through the midnight woods. The silence in the iron-bound hall of Thornhaven was no longer empty. It was occupied by the suffocating or frigid aura of King Thorne. Jaxon stood paralyzed, his hand still gripped tightly around Sloane's waist, though his knuckles had turned a ghostly white. He had expected to be the victor of the night, the alpha-to-be who had finally purged the Blackwood stain from his lineage. Instead, he looked like a man who had accidentally stepped into the path of an avalanche. Beside him, Sloane's triumphant smirk had curdled into a mask of pure terror. Her eyes darted from Nyx's unnerving composure to the towering armored figure of the Iron King, whose very breath seemed to mist in the suddenly freezing air. Thorne did not grant the Thornhaven alphas the courtesy of a glance. His attention remained locked on Nyx, his obsidian eyes tracing the sharp line of her jaw as if he were memorizing the face of a new and precious conquest. With a subtle tilt of his head, the king signaled his personal guard. 4 warriors, all clad in matte black plate that seemed to swallow the torchlight, stepped forward. The heavy thud of their boots against the stone floor echoed like a funeral march. They did not touch Nyx with the roughness she had endured for years. They surrounded her with the precision of a lethal cage, their presence a silent vow of protection against the pack that had just discarded her. "The tribute is settled," Thorne's voice rumbled, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. "Thornhaven's debts are forgiven in exchange for the girl. Touch her again, and I will consider it an act of war against the North." Jaxon opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to claim some vestige of authority, but the words died in his throat as Thorne's gaze finally flicked toward him. It was a look of such profound predatory dismissal that Jaxon actually recoiled, his boots scuffing the dirt. Nyx did not look back, or she did not cast a final glance at the home that had been her prison or the man who had been her undoing. She walked forward, her head held high, as the black-armored guard escorted her toward the massive oak doors of the hall. As she stepped out into the night, the air changed. The familiar scent of the Thornhaven pines was replaced by the biting metallic tang of an approaching winter. Waiting in the courtyard was a carriage of obsidian wood, pulled by 4 massive horses with eyes that glowed like dying embers. Nyx felt the weight of Thorne's presence behind her as he followed, a shadow that promised both safety and a different kind of peril. When the carriage door clicked shut, the world of her childhood vanished. As the wheels began to churn against the frozen earth, Nyx watched the flickering lights of the pack house fade into the distance, realizing she wasn't just leaving a village. She was entering a realm of iron and ash where mercy was a myth and the king was a god. But a different power was moving in the shadows. Observing the chaos with eyes as sharp as obsidian was King Thorne, the Iron King of the North. He was the apex predator of the 5 realms, a man whose very presence brought the frost of a supernatural winter and whose heart was whispered to be turning to literal stone. He was a ruler who had spent over a decade shunning the advances of noble houses and high-ranking beauties, a king who had forgotten the warmth of human emotion. Yet, as he watched the outcast girl accept her fate without a single plea for mercy, something within his frozen chest stirred with a lethal possessive intensity. The air in the hall grew thin, the temperature plummeting as his aura expanded. The mocking whispers died instantly. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was the suffocating, a heavy dread of a god who had just found something worth claiming. The journey into the north was a descent into a world where color had been bled dry, replaced by a landscape of skeletal trees and white-veined stone. When the carriage finally slowed, the massive gates of the Iron Kingdom groaned open like the jaws of a prehistoric beast. Nyx pressed her palm against the frost-patterned glass, her breath hitching at the sight of the fortress of ash. It was a cathedral of jagged obsidian and black iron, its towers piercing the low-hanging slate-grey clouds like broken needles. This was not a home. It was a monument to isolation, standing defiant against an eternal snow that fell in heavy, silent flakes, coating the ramparts in a shroud of white. As the carriage door opened, the air hit Nyx like a physical blow, a dry, soul-piercing cold that made the lungs ache. King Thorne stepped out first, his boots crunching on the frozen earth with a sound like shattering glass. He turned, offering a hand that was encased in a glove of fine, dark leather. When Nyx reached out, placing her fingers in his, she didn't find the expected warmth of an alpha's touch. Instead, an unnatural chill seeped through the leather, deeper and more predatory than the winter air around them. It was a cold that didn't just touch the skin. It reached for the marrow. "The citadel is old," Thorne murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the howling wind. "It does not welcome strangers easily." He led her through the great hall, a cavernous space where the walls were lined with the frozen trophies of 1,000 years. There were no fires in the hearths, only the dim flickering blue of mage lights that cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. As they walked, Nyx realized, with a mounting sense of dread, that the frost on the walls wasn't coming from the outside. It was radiating from the center of the room, from the throne itself, and from the man walking beside her. Thorne paused at the foot of the grand staircase, his silhouette framed by the towering windows of the north. For a moment, his guard dropped, and Nyx saw the way his fingers stiffened, his skin pale as marble. When his sleeve shifted, she caught a glimpse of his wrist. Not the flush of living blood, but a vein of dark, crystalline obsidian creeping beneath the surface of his flesh. He wasn't just a cold ruler, he was a man being consumed by the very ice he commanded. As he looked down at her, his eyes devoid of the heat of life, Nyx felt the first spark of her suppressed fire flicker in her chest. A desperate, instinctive rebellion against the tomb of iron and ash that now held her captive. She was a guest of the king, but in this frozen silence, she felt more like a sacrifice to the winter. The flickering mage lights of the private study cast long, skeletal shadows against the walls of the fortress of ash. Nyx stood by a heavy oak table, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of a map of the north, while King Thorne stood by the narrow window, his back to her. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the distant mournful howl of the wind battering the obsidian towers. In the dim light, Thorne looked less like a man and more like a statue, carved from the very mountain the castle sat upon. His stillness was unnatural, a frozen poise that suggested even the act of breathing was a calculated effort. When he finally turned to speak, his foot stumbled, a momentary lapse in his predatory grace that sent a heavy silver chalice skittering toward the edge of the table. Without thinking, Nyx lunged to catch it, her hand brushing firmly against Thorne's bare forearm as he reached for the same object. The contact was electric, but not with heat. The world around Nyx vanished in an instant. He was swallowed by a psychic surge of absolute zero. She wasn't in the study anymore. She was deep within a cavern of glass and shadow, staring into a chest cavity that hummed with a low dissonant vibration. There, pulsing with a sluggish, agonizing rhythm, was a heart. But it was no longer flesh and blood. Striations of dark, gleaming obsidian were weaving through the muscle, like parasitic vines, turning the soft tissue into rigid, unyielding stone. With every beat, more of the organ crystallized. The black minerals spreading toward the great vessels with the inevitability of a closing tomb. The pain she felt through the connection was a vast, hollow ache, the sound of a soul being silenced by the weight of 300 years of winter. Nyx gasped, pulling her hand away as if burned by the frost. She stumbled back, her chest heaving. The phantom image of that shattering heart still burned into her mind's eye. Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of fractured composure. A single vein of obsidian pulsed at his temple, darker than before. "You saw it," he stated, his voice a low, jagged rasp that held no room for comfort. He didn't move toward her. Instead, he stepped further into the shadows, the temperature in the room dropping until Nyx's own breath came in thick white plumes. "That is the price of the crown I wear. The ice does not just claim the land, Nyx. It claims the vessel that rules it." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting a lonely hunger that warred with his lethal restraint. "Stay away from me," he warned, the command vibrating with a desperate edge. "My blood is becoming glass, and my heart is turning to stone. If you get too close, the winter in me will not care that you are the only warmth left in this world. It will simply freeze you solid, along with me." The traditional northern hunt was not a sport. It was a cold, brutal display of dominance meant to weed out the weak. Lying under a sky the color of a bruised plum, the nobility of the surrounding territories gathered at the edge of the frostwood, their breath rising in thick plumes. Nyx stood beside King Thorne, her furs draped over her shoulders like a heavy secret. The air turned brittle when a familiar scent drifted through the pines, the sharp, arrogant musk of Thornhaven. Jaxon and Sloane stepped into the clearing, their eyes widening as they saw Nyx positioned not as a servant, but as a shadow at the king's right hand. Jaxon's ego, fueled by the presence of other alphas, could not remain silent. He stepped forward, a mocking smirk playing on his lips as he glanced at Nyx's half-blood features. "I see the Iron Kingdom has lowered its standards for its guests," he drawled, his voice carrying across the silent clearing. "Back home, we knew better than to let a stray sit at the high table. She's little more than a broken omen, Thorne. I'm surprised she hasn't brought your castle down with her mother's bad luck." Sloane let out a sharp, tinkling laugh that grated against the silence. The temperature in the clearing didn't just drop. It plummeted. The hounds stopped baying, their tails tucking between their legs, as King Thorne slowly turned his head. His obsidian eyes were devoid of light, reflecting only the terrifying static cold of the glacier. "You stand in my domain." Thorne's voice was a vibrating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. He moved with a speed that defied his stony condition, closing the distance until he was towering over Jaxon. "You speak of standards while smelling of cowardice and unwashed debt. You rejected a treasure because you were too small a man to handle her fire, and now you dare to insult the woman under my protection." Thorne's hand shot out, not to strike, but to exert a pressure so immense that Jaxon was forced to his knees in the frozen slush. The Iron King's aura expanded, a visible shimmer of frost coating Jaxon's boots and traveling up his legs, pinning him to the spot. "Nyx is the only reason your pack still has a name to claim," Thorne hissed, his face inches from Jaxon's terrified mask. "Apologize to your queen, or I will leave you here for the wolves to find when the thaw comes in 100 years. Jaxon's pride shattered in the face of true apex power. He stammered a broken apology, his face pressed toward the ice. When Thorne finally stepped back, He didn't look at the fallen alpha. He reached out and took Nyx's hand. This time, as their skin met, the cold didn't bite. Instead, Nyx felt a thrum of recognition, a silent, ironclad promise that for the first time in her life, she was not alone in the dark. In that moment, the hunt was forgotten, replaced by a bond forged in the crucible of his frozen heart and her rising heat. The air in the Forbidden Library was different from the rest of the Citadel. It didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy with the weight of suppressed history. Rows of obsidian shelves reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow, housing thousands of scrolls that hummed with a faint dissonant magic. Nyx moved through the aisles like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by centuries of dust. She was searching for anything that mentioned the Blackwood name, a lineage her pack had treated as a terminal infection. Deep within a recessed alcove, she discovered a shelf concealed behind a heavy velvet shroud. Unlike the official records of the North, these journals were bound in scorched leather and marked with the personal seal of Varkas, the king's chief advisor. Her fingers trembled as she pulled a slender volume from the stack, the parchment crackling like dry bone as she opened it. The ink was dark and jagged, written with the frantic precision of a man obsessed. Her breath hitched as she found her mother's name. For 20 years, Nyx had lived with the crushing guilt that her mother's weakness and subsequent fever were the results of the Blackwood curse. But as she scanned the advisor's private ledgers, the truth began to bleed through the lies. Varkas hadn't been treating her mother. He had been monitoring her. "The flame of the South cannot be allowed to touch the Iron Throne," one entry read, the handwriting digging deep into the paper. "If the Blackwood blood reaches the king, the winter will shatter. The transition to stone must be completed for the new order to rise." Nyx's heart hammered against her ribs, a heat she had spent years smothering, suddenly roaring to life in her veins. Further down, the entries became more clinical, more monstrous. Varkas detailed the slow administration of a rare, ice-veined toxin, a poison that mimicked the symptoms of a natural wasting sickness. Her mother hadn't died of a frail heart. She had been systematically extinguished to ensure Thorne remained a frozen, controllable figurehead. The realization hit Nyx with the force of a physical blow. Her mother had been the first sacrifice in a war she hadn't known existed. Varkas wasn't just a loyal servant. He was the architect of the king's suffering and the murderer of her lineage. As the temperature in the alcove began to rise, the frost on the nearby shelves melting into weeping trails of water, Nyx realized her presence in the North wasn't a coincidence of fate. She was the one thing Varkas feared most, the living fire that could melt his carefully constructed empire of ice. Clutching the journal to her chest, she looked toward the door, the wall of apathy she had built finally crumbling to reveal a furnace of incandescent rage. Then the blizzard outside the citadel was a screaming ghost, a wall of white that sought to bury the Iron Kingdom once and for all. Inside the royal solar, the air had reached a lethal, crystalline stillness. King Thorne lay back against his furs, his eyes half closed and clouded with a milky obsidian film. The curse had moved with terrifying speed. The veins in his neck were no longer pulsing with blood, but standing out as black, unyielding ridges of stone. Every breath he took sounded like the rasp of a blade against a whetstone. Nyx knelt beside him, the cold radiating from his body, so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek, and recoiled as she felt the texture of cold marble instead of skin. He was slipping away, his consciousness being swallowed by the 300-year-old frost that had finally reached his core. "Thorne," she whispered, to her voice cracking in the sub-zero air. "Don't let it take you. Don't go into the dark." He didn't answer, his jaw locked in a frozen grimace. Desperation, hot and jagged, tore through the wall of apathy Nyx had built around her heart. She didn't think of the danger or the advisor's warnings. She moved purely on instinct, pulling his heavy, stiffening body against hers. She wrapped her arms around his chest, pressing her face into the crook of his neck, trying to shield him with her own warmth. For a moment, the cold threatened to extinguish her, but then she felt it, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the base of her skull. It was the Blackwood fire, the taint she had been taught to loathe, rising up to meet the threat. She stopped fighting it. Instead of suppressing the heat, she fanned it, letting a flicker of incandescent magic bleed from her skin into his. The reaction was violent. A soft golden light began to pulse where their bodies met, and the frost on Thorne's furs turning to steam with a sharp hiss. He let out a choked, agonizing gasp as the ice in his veins began to fracture. His hand, still partially stone, spasmed and clutched at her cloak, anchoring him to the living world. As the lethal chill began to recede, Thorne opened his eyes. They were no longer obsidian voids. They were human, brimming with a raw, terrifying vulnerability that Nyx had never seen. He looked at her not as a king, but as a man who had been drowning in a frozen sea and had finally found the shore. For a long, breathless minute, they stayed tangled together in the dim light, the only source of warmth in a world of ash. In the silence of the storm, the barrier between them didn't just crack. It began to melt, leaving them both exposed to a heat that was far more dangerous than the cold. The fragile piece of the solar was shattered by the sound of heavy iron-toed boots and the frantic shouting of the citadel guards. Varkas burst into the room, his face a calculated mask of horror, followed by a dozen warriors with their blades drawn. King Thorne lay motionless on the furs, his skin a deathly, translucent grey. A half-empty vial of shimmering violet liquid resting on the floor beside him. Nyx stood over him, her hands still glowing with the fading warmth of her magic. But in the eyes of the terrified guards, she looked like a witch caught in the act of a final lethal hex. "Seize her," Varkas bellowed, his voice echoing like a death knell through the stone chamber. "She has poisoned the king. She used her mother's tainted blood to finish what the winter started." Nyx looked at the advisor, seeing the cold triumph gleaming in his eyes. She realized with a sickening jolt that the tonic he had provided for Thorne earlier that evening had been the true catalyst, timed perfectly to spike just as she attempted to heal him. The guards, fueled by generations of superstitions about the Blackwood lineage, didn't hesitate. They lunged forward, their steel whistling through the frigid air. Nyx barely evaded the first strike, her instincts screaming as she realized the man who had protected her was currently a prisoner of his own body. Thorne's eyes were open but rolled back, his jaw locked in a silent scream of agony. "I didn't do this," she cried out, but her voice was drowned by the roar of the warriors. Varkas stepped toward her, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predatory beast. "You are an abomination, Nyx," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear. "The North belongs to the ice, not to a half-blood spark." With a desperate surge of energy, Nyx slammed her palms against the stone floor. A shockwave of pure white-hot heat erupted from her, melting the frost on the walls and knocking the lead guards backward in a cloud of blinding steam. She didn't wait to see if they recovered. Heart hammering against her ribs, she vaulted over the balcony railing, disappearing into the swirling chaos of the midnight blizzard. The transition from the warmth of the solar to the absolute zero of the frozen wastes was a physical assault. The wind tore at her cloak, and the snow blinded her as she stumbled toward the jagged silhouettes of the Iron Mountains. Behind her, the horns of the citadel began to blow, a rhythmic, terrifying sound that signaled the start of a great hunt. She was no longer a guest or a potential queen. She was a fugitive, cast out once again into a world of ash and bone, with nothing but her mother's forbidden fire to keep her from becoming a permanent monument to the winter. The mountain air was a serrated blade, as cutting through Nyx's thin cloak as she climbed higher into the jagged peaks of the Iron Range. Behind her, the distant baying of the king's hounds echoed against the canyon walls, a relentless reminder that she was being hunted as a regicide. Her lungs burned with every breath of ice, But deep beneath her skin, a different kind of heat was beginning to pulse, a rhythmic subterranean thrum that pulled her toward a hidden crevice in the black rock. Guided by a memory that wasn't her own, Nyx stumbled into a cavern that smelled of ancient cedar and dried sage. In the center sat a hearth of smooth, river-worn stones, untouched by the frost that had claimed the rest of the world. This was her mother's sanctuary, the place where the Blackwood lineage had kept the embers of the old world alive. As Nyx collapsed onto the ash-covered floor, her fingers brushed a series of carvings on the hearthstone, a sun entwined with a wolf's head. The moment her skin touched the stone, the cave erupted in a blinding violet light. Images flooded her mind, not of a half-blood abomination, but of a lineage designed to be the equilibrium of the world. She saw the first Blackwood witch and the first Iron King, forging a pact of fire and ice, a balance that had been sabotaged by men like Varkas, who thrived in the static, frozen dark. She wasn't a broken wolf, she was the missing half of a cosmic design. "I am not the curse," Nyx whispered, her voice gaining a resonance that made the cavern floor tremble. The apathy she had worn as armor finally shattered, releasing a tidal wave of incandescent energy. The suppressed fire didn't just flicker, it roared, turning her silver hair into a halo of white-hot light and her eyes into molten gold. The frost on the cavern walls didn't just melt, it vaporized. She felt the ancient prophecy click into place, the realization that the flame of the north was never meant to destroy the king, but to liberate him. The baying of the hounds grew closer, but Nyx no longer felt like prey. She stood up, the hearth behind her glowing with a heat that could be felt for miles across the tundra. She was no longer running. With the full weight of her ancestors' power surging through her veins, she turned back toward the citadel. The north was a kingdom of iron, but she was the fire that would make it bend. She was the flame of the north, and it was time for the world to burn away the lies of the winter. The iron citadel was no longer a fortress, it had become a tomb of jagged black glass. As Nyx crested the final ridge, she saw the sky above the towers churning with a localized, unnatural blizzard. The air didn't just carry the cold, it carried the scent of death and stagnant magic. Inside the great hall, the transformation had reached its zenith. King Thorne was slumped upon his throne, his skin entirely replaced by shimmering obsidian. He was a statue of agony, his eyes two dim dying embers behind a veil of stone. Varkas stood before the throne, his arms raised as he channeled the last of the king's life force into a dark, pulsing orb. He turned as the massive oak doors were incinerated, exploding inward in a shower of sparks and molten iron. Nyx walked through the fire, her silhouette a blinding gold against the gloom. The guards who attempted to intercept her were thrown back by a mere wave of her hand, their shields melting like wax. "You are too late, half-blood," Varkas shrieked, his face contorting with a frantic, desperate malice. "The king is stone, the winter is eternal." Nyx didn't waste words. She moved with the predatory grace of a wolf and the scorching speed of a solar flare. When Varkas unleashed a torrent of shadow magic, she met it with a wall of white-hot brilliance that turned his darkness into ash. Closing the distance in a heartbeat, she shifted partially, her claws glowing with incandescent heat as she tore through his magical defenses. With a final guttural snarl of "For my mother," she unleashed a localized burst of fire that consumed Varkas's treachery, leaving nothing but a pile of scorched robes on the frozen floor. The hall fell into a terrifying silence. Nyx turned to the throne, her heart breaking at the sight of the frozen king. She climbed the dais, her warmth causing the frost on the steps to hiss and vanish. She reached out, cradling Thorne's stone face in her hands. The obsidian was so cold it bit into her palms, but she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that carried the weight of her ancestors, her grief, and her newfound love. The reaction was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the north. A shockwave of golden light erupted from the point of contact, spiderwebbing across Thorne's body. The obsidian shattered, falling away in heavy shards to reveal the living, breathing man beneath. Thorne gasped, his lungs filling with air that was suddenly, miraculously warm. As the curse broke, the sky outside cleared, and the sun, unseen for 300 years, spilled over the horizon, bathing the Iron Kingdom in a dawn of crimson and gold. Standing amidst the ruins of the winter, Thorne looked up at Nyx, his eyes burning with a fierce human devotion. He didn't need to speak. He reached for the iron crown that had fallen to the floor and placed it upon her brow. In that moment, the Outcast was no more. The North had found its son, and its queen was finally home.